Okay, everybody, thank you. I think we're about ready to get the lecture going. Thanks, everybody, for coming in on a rainy, cold day, the day before spring break. So this is great. It's wonderful to see this, to see a wonderful turnout. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome back to USC. I'm Frank Barkow, who has flown in from Berlin, where he founded with Regina Leibinger many years ago, Barkow Leibinger, an architectural office that presently is about 70 human beings doing extraordinary work, some of which he will certainly be sharing with us in the next hour here. And I think the thing I would say probably first and foremost, an office that has been almost surgical in how it organizes and designs itself to do the kind of work that will be shared today and will be the topic of today's presentation. The work is possible in part from, I think, a kind of brilliant organization of an office and expertise and skill sets and knowledge that spans an incredible spectrum of not just architectural, but technical, material, construction, art, installation, expertise that's all brought together across the individual projects, but also makes possible a catalog of work that is simply stunning for its demand about what the breadth of an architectural practice should be. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a minute. It's an award-winning office that I think many of you will know for some of the projects that it has produced for many years. And it is an office, Barkow Leibinger is an office that deliberately spans between practice, building, architecture, teaching, and research, all of which has been thoroughly documented in many years of publications, exhibitions, and other materials. And he'll share some of that with us today also. Frank has been a visiting professor at, amongst other schools, the GSD at Harvard, EPFL, the Polytechnic in Lausanne, in Switzerland, in Stuttgart at the Academy there in Germany, at Cornell, the Architectural Association in London, and here at USC, where in 2013, Frank was here for at least a week, probably longer, for a terrific workshop that some of you will find online and that he showed me yesterday as we were driving across town, that lives in YouTube worlds these days, but is a kind of fantastic clip of some of your student predecessors and an intense week-long experience that was all about seeing what people can do in 7 days instead of a full semester, and it's pretty dazzling stuff right out here in the courtyard. It's a kind of Conrad Boxman meets California color combination in just a super interesting way. And in fact, connects, I think, deeply to something that's driven Frank's professional work and his teaching for many years, which is that we learn and think architecture by its making. In fact, I would argue that Barkow Leibinger, as much as anyone today, is in a lineage of modern experimental architects that really believe the way you figure out where architecture goes is you just start making it. It's a kind of culture of prototyping and making that in fact is possible, I would say, in part from how they organized their brilliant practice in Berlin, but also I think part of Frank's own biography, which I think I'll close with here, which is we're welcoming Frank back to Los Angeles today as a product of the American West, Montana specifically, and a place that has actually made stuff in really interesting ways forever, and in fact ways of building and construction like timber framing that's very unique to the culture and the geography of that place, but also was done at Frank's earliest moment of his own education in Bozeman at Montana State, in a school that, not unlike ours, had architecture in one place and right next to it a school of architecture. And in many ways, I think the work that has come out for so many years in his own practice is a result of this kind of collision between art and architectural worlds in really unique ways. Everybody join me in welcoming Frank Barkow.
Thanks, Brett. It's a good one. Thanks for coming. I know it's the day before spring break, so appreciate y'all showing up. And but that's true. I mean, you framed that really well. I think this idea of making and ideation, or ideas or concept coming from making, this kind of back and forth. And I think that's been central to our teaching for a long, long time. So I think that's how we set the practice up, and also we like the idea very much of how the practice informs our teaching and how that works back and forth. So I call this talk Berlin Stories, but it actually does start in Montana where I grew up. And so you know, in the sense of been in Berlin for the last 30 years, but a lot of it really had to do, particularly how I worked with growing up in Montana, these like Super 8 homemade movies from the 60s that my father probably made from Glacier Park trips. But for me, this was a kind of introduction for what would become, you know, a kind of idea for me about what architecture was in terms of landscape, incredibly dynamic, and you know, really sparsely populated place, Montana, growing up in the 60s and 70s, and then going to school there in the 80s. But this was really the place that I grew up. And then in terms of architecture, there, you might find things, you know, like examples like Cass Gilbert's Montana Club in Helena, built in 1903, or we recently did a studio in Bozeman, and we started by looking at these Violette Leduc drawings of Mont Blanc, where Leduc was abstracting these almost like a shaper or a glass chain architects, which would come later in the 20s in Germany, but in a way of geometricizing. We set up a studio where students would take a kind of land formation and translate it through drawing and model making into forms like that. So at the same time, you know, my first introduction to kind of, you know, formal education was in a factory. This is the Archie Bray brick factory at the time, which has now become the Archie Bray Ceramics Foundation. So, you know, artists like Dasher Gates have been working here recently, or other artists, you know, producing work here. So, and my first teachers were people, you know, like Volkas, who came out of Black Mountain College, who were using ceramics in a completely different way in terms of a kind of abstract expressionism, but this idea of working in an incredibly, you know, physical way with your hands, with mud and clay, and creating things, in this case, ceramics, which became almost environmental, like almost a kind of, you know, we were talking about the kind of Merzbau idea of a kind of space making through this kind of production. After high school, I worked as a carpenter, as a framer through the Rocky Mountains, where I learned to construct. I learned how to read construction drawings and how to translate that into building forms. So this idea of that there was never a kind of gap between representation of drawings and the things you actually made that was sort of impressed on to me as a kind of carpenter apprentice in those days. I went to Bozeman, you know, I studied undergraduate school there, later went to Harvard, you know, which is a kind of cow town. But there was architecture like this Ozzie Berg, which was a timber, large span structure above. So even within this context was kind of examples of that kind of architecture. There was a Neutra log cabin built in Bozeman. It's really interesting. But this idea of experimental was a way of working within the practice in terms of, you know, kind of parallel activity, kind of building projects in the practice, but as a way of thinking and setting up projects. And this idea of bricolage is a way of working, of collecting both sort of tools and techniques, technologies, which we could sort of exploit or use within our own work as really a way of working in the kind of day-to-day. And then with Brett, you know, at the AA, we started a kind of a book project, which we call the Atlases, which are kind of like manuals, and I think we could make these things quick. We made these things like in weeks that really emphasized the processes of production, of making things through different tools, through different materials, and how that might set up a project. So, and around this time, we stopped doing architectural exhibition really of drawings and models, and started producing what we call offcuts, or pieces that came out of our production in different, again, materials and techniques, working with students. So it was a new idea for us, you know, about 20 years in terms of how exhibition might be able to frame our work. Again, this like, how does technology, in this case, digital laser cutting, that students would produce in the practice. And we really like this idea of the practice being a kind of, which is kind of an old-fashioned idea, but the idea of an apprenticeship of coming in and in a way solving problems or answering questions that we had to, we're looking at in terms of technology. So on the left would be like rethinking the idea of space frame. We were talking about Conrad Waxman's work earlier. What would that mean in terms of contemporary technology today? So these kinds of tests, what's kind of culminated in an exhibition we did a few years ago at the Haus am Waldsee in Berlin, which is Berlin's sort of original Museum of Modern Art, where it acted as a kind of Schaulager, which is German for a kind of exhibition place of these kind of both models, but also pieces of working at a scale of 1:1. So these are kind of interesting. These are archival shots in a warehouse. This is during COVID, right? So we took all of our work materials out of archive and put it in this gigantic warehouse as a way of selecting and editing work for a kind of retrospective exhibition, which in itself was a kind of created this almost a kind of landscape of models and 1:1 details and work pieces within this space. So as a way of looking at it, so you see both kind of model work as well as installation scale work, this sort of thicket piece made out of tessellated stainless steel wire using a coat hanger factory to produce these things. So Germany was also an idea about exploiting fabrication, a place. Germany has a long history of production and manufacturing in shops that are very keen on working with people like architects. This was a kinetic wall we had produced for the 2014 Venice Biennale for Ram's fundamentals show on wall construction. As well as, again, installation, sort of outside of the exhibition space or gallery space. This is an installation we did for Carson Chan, who was curating the Marrakesh Biennale in 2012, right before we did the workshop here in a space next to the Katabia Mosque, where we produced in our studios, kind of digitally produced models by hand in a very kind of computer-friendly oriented way. These hyperbolic surfaces, which then, which is another thing I'm interested in, like how do you translate that in terms of local building cultures, where we brought the materials on site, with donkey power and in timber construction, using the local fabricators, weavers to produce this sort of structure. So in a way, these exist as a 1:1 scale, but the idea of this was that it could have a kind of currency as a kind of prototype. It could translate to another scale, sort of architectural scale that might be an industrial project, but kind of using these for setting up later projects. And it's just kind of bouncing around from sort of conceiving this project in Berlin in our studios and then translating it through both the material and building culture of a place like Marrakesh, which is quite different than say northern Germany, and then begin to think about how these projects might translate into architectural projects. So this is a project I did in Berlin for a permanent project for the American Academy, the Fellows Pavilion, which then translated into steel construction as a hyperbolic, prefabricated steel structure, which we could kind of bring in and drop into the gardens of this, very sort of formal Fellows American Academy in Berlin as a kind of institution, and bringing that in. So in a way that would show how some of these things start to inform each other. And we're also talking about history and being interested in revisiting history. So for example, tensegrity is a technology that's been around for quite a while, going all the way back into, say, Buckminster Fuller, which always to me seemed like a kind of incomplete project. It was a project which usually existed at a kind of sculptural scale. And I was, interested in how this might translate. So we tested some of this in timber construction in a weird kind of sort of ghillie suit fabric skin for the piece in a site in Spain, which we could construct in a few days as kind of temporary pop-up kind of space for the this kind of exhibition series that was done in Locarno in Spain. But with the idea of like if that could translate into say high-rise construction, which would be extremely lightweight in timber and cable structure, but putting floors into it. But like, could this again for me a kind of incomplete project translate into a much more architecturally programmable project, which seemed to be incomplete or hadn't been really kind of sorted out. So we would bring our engineers from Knippers Helbeck from Stuttgart, and which has this long legacy of engineering going all the way back to Frei Otto, and ask them if this thing would work, and it would be stable. Could we do this as a permanent construction, which we could. So again, a lot of this is about setting up projects. Some of these we haven't built yet, but a kind of setting up for projects. So in a way, another example, like the Serpentine in London, we built a temporary summer house here as a kind of coil structure, as a pavilion. Often we use pavilions as a kind of intermediate project between more experimental and the more permanent building practice. But these kind of projects. So again, this is a project that could aggregate. It could be constructed in a permanent way. We learned how to build this thing in these kind of aircraft hangars up in Yorkshire, in England. We skinned these things with a kind of bendy plywood in terms of constructing them. But again, looking at these things as prototypes, in a sense, beyond their sort of immediate and obvious purpose-built identity in a place like this, the Kensington Gardens in London, as a kind of project. So these are, I guess, a kind of mediator projects between, again, the kind of more open-ended experimental pieces. It's a project that traveled then to our Berlin exhibition. We reclad it in aluminum, had a different sort of afterlife there. Casting, again, some of these talk about procedures. We'll run workshops with students. This is one of our GST students in our practice. Again, kind of carving out sort of project space or exhibition space within the practice to test different ideas. So this was a potter, a woman from here who had skills for double sort of pouring. Not pouring, but throwing on the wheel, this kind of double skin. So, and these things are sort of scalable. So they have a kind of identity as scalable pieces that we make. At the same time, we were thinking about can we make these extrusions and things that work at a one-to-one scale that could be integrated in our building. So these are extrusions for cladding. Again, interested in say ceramic. Skins, particularly on timber structures, which may be a solution here with your problems with fire and timber construction that we saw in an incredibly strong way today. But again, using German fabricators who will produce these things as one-offs, as custom elements, is something we can do, and in a way economically for some of the buildings we're producing. So this is the building for a kind of loft building as an infill project against infrastructure, in this case along the elevated railway on the right, that gets sort of implemented or put into our buildings. Part of that, again, that earlier show, the two walls, was casting, where we started casting with infra-light concrete. Infra-light concrete is a self-insulated concrete. We're now working with bio-based concrete and then casting. So our crew could go to the prefab factory, which is in Potsdam, not far from our office, and we started just basically casting with infilite concrete, but just using junk basically to cast this. So on the right is, and again, this idea of bricolage. This is all debris from World War II, from the so-called Devil's Mountains, which we cast into the hey, so this idea of a kind of technologically advanced concrete, but and then sort of marrying it with just materials that we find on site to produce two walls. So we use this as kind of entrance to the exhibition, but these could obviously work as building components. You can stack them, you can add them. They're structural, they're load bearing. They could also work as infill pieces. So we literally went out and through this gravel, made the forms, cast these pieces, even, tested the sort of insulation quality of these things. Got these guys from Czechoslovakia that put these things into place. And they had sort of afterlife site. We moved them into a garden for an artist, Thomas Struth. But again, as a way of, and going back to the project that we started with Brett, this idea of an atlas, in a way creating in an archival way our own techniques for our own building products in a way. So all this stuff sort of supersedes things. In the old days, we used suites catalogs where you would find everything in the catalog, where we found we could build almost any construction component in a place like Germany by working directly with companies. So that means wall making, facade making, roof making, construction components, including one that we're doing right now. And this is for the Venice Biennale, which will open our piece in May. But again, thinking about concrete casting, we started by looking at terrazzo as a technique that goes all the way back to the Roman days. With glass, we went to this famous island outside of Venice, Murano, where it's famous for years and years of casting glass out there. Carlos Scarpa would work directly with these companies and gathering this material as waste material. So in producing glass at a place like Murano or the beautiful vases, produce a lot of glass waste, which we could basically have for free. And then we looked at the history of terrazzo making, which was mostly a kind of two-dimensional or kind of floor making, with the interest of creating a kind of landscape. So we did mapping there. We thought about how you could cast these pieces, so we made casts that have to do with mapping Murano to create these pieces, how they could be efficient in terms of material, looking at bio-based concrete for producing these things. So in a sense, it's a fairly economic, concrete could also be self-insulated with a sort of insulate concrete, and started producing these elements in our workshops in order to create, this piece will be a kind of landscape or kind of a guard. So we're working with Tangradi, a landscape architect in Berlin, to produce these pieces, both off-site and on-site, and then situate them into one of the gardens of the Giardini at the Venice Biennale in front of the Austrian pavilion here. So it's a piece we can build. At the end, we can sell these pieces or donate them to the Biennale. But again, a kind of construction kind of idea that could continue at different scales. Again, using the experience, or again, using exhibitions or biennales like this in terms of an idea of production and of making of pieces, and understanding the economics and the complexity of forming these pieces and making them. So with again a very kind of close connection between the office and what we're doing. Bundling is another, again, a kind of formal technique for production. This was an earlier exhibition with laser cut plexiglass tubes, then scripted, and then created in these kind of stalagmite formations with a space, using again a kind of laser cutting company in Munich who have produced these things. So they have the tools, but we have the scripting technologies to produce these things for a kind of exhibition. The ticket you saw a minute ago, which we had done, which did come out of the Conrad Waxman's certain reference to the grapevine structure that he conceived of, in the 50s as a kind of space frame. Again, could be scalable. My clicker sort of flipped out. Do I have to point somewhere? Oh, I can do that. Okay, that always work. So again, like I said, we use a coat hanger company to produce these things, and then we sort of we kind of welded them together. It took forever, so we ended up sort of using zip ties to put this thing together. We were proposing this also for serpentine, that you could create canopies, but again, vertical structure, which is usually walls or columns, could be an almost tessellated, very, in a way, ephemeral structure that was load-bearing, incredibly started, even though you're building these pieces out of 2 millimeter thick, stainless steel, zip tying them together. This is where we installed it at Princeton with a floor and a roof, but again, kind of cooking these things up as prototypes that again kind of fit into our catalog. So what these things would do, would produce. So this was an idea for, in this case, affordable housing for Berlin, as towers which could insert into Berlin, where Berlin's a very diffuse city. Like, how can you create density? You can drop these towers without impacting negatively anyone's light or air rights views. So we tried one in metal, we tried one in timber, we tried one in infra-light concrete on the left, where we again use the kind of again the trees, the kind of Berlin pine trees, not as surrogate columns, but as a kind of little forest of structure to produce a kind of high-rise structure. So you could use CLT and peeled log as timber construction for high-rise becomes more, through legislation, more and more easy to do in Europe, to kind of produce these spaces. So again, the kind of experiment that could lead to projects like this, which could be for, again, a kind of housing prototype, which was adaptable and siteable in many different locations in Berlin. Another example was thinking about the marriage file for the Chicago Biennale a couple of years ago, which we used cardboard tubes, which obviously are structural. And again, you'll see Girl Back, people like this pioneered this a long time ago, but we wanted a very different idea of using it. So this is a kind of installation in the entrance lobby at the Culture Center at the Chicago Biennale with these materials, but through a kind of ruled geometry attaching to these pieces, we could produce these kinds of structures, which again could be a kind of interior, but could also function as a kind of freestanding pavilion-like or aggregatable structure, which again we tested in our show fence, or our kind of exhibition space in Berlin, and then translated it to Chicago. So and again, using these kinds of exhibitions as a way for setting up these projects. Again, Germany, of course, is famous for structural engineering, so we like to work with structural engineers who can produce ideas for projects. We set this project up with their Sobek, whose project is about lightness. He's the sort of professor successor from Prado in Stuttgart. And he said, you can build your things in timber, but we're not going to get away from concrete. We need concrete, it's good material, but we'll use less of it. So Vader's idea was gradient concrete, which is basically concrete would be like a bone structure. So if you cut a section through your arm and you look at the bone, you would see it's porous, like on the left. So in a way, it's parametrically conceived so that you have material and strength where you need it in a kind of structurally calculatable way. So this is his idea of reducing. So in a structure where you can reduce 50% of the concrete by, in a sense, aerating it or making it a much more porous sort of structure. So, this seemed interesting to us. So, but our wish was to like, what are the consequences if you could do this? So, we started making these structures, particularly the idea of suspended structures that could hang from a kind of mainframe structure. If you had very light floor plates, you could produce these kinds of hanging elements. So that was sort of our reaction to his idea of producing this kind of concrete. And again, looking back to history, we're looking at things like Kansas City high rise, where we built this mainframe structure on the left here, and then started hanging the floor plates from that. So the idea being you could build this incredibly quick thing. It was never built, but again, it was a kind of repairing of this project with Etherlite concrete, which would make that project even simpler and easier to do as a kind of whatever programmable programs, gardens, landscapes in a kind of hanging structure, coming directly as a response to that. But like I said, I mean, we're still running a building project. This structure had to do with looking at the Barkow Trust. We did an industrial site in Chicago near the O'Hare Airport. Over here, this is an abandoned AT&T kind of corporate office park. So you could kind of poach land here. You can buy it cheaply along the highway to build a factory that's relatively close to Chicago, but in a kind of urban, suburban space where this thing would make sense. Clients could come in and look at machine tools which are made here. Chicago, again, this Stephen Shore image, fascinated us, with the idea of all this stuff in Americana, which is somehow weirdly architectural as a visual about signage, but at the same time has these kind of structural implications for it. So we produced this factory, which is a factory showroom where machines are produced that can be looked at by clients. This is an array for making parts for John Deere tractors. This is office spaces here, auditorium, courtyard, again, adjacent to a kind of wetlands. But we wanted to sort of feature or look at the Barkow trusses. So we use their machines to laser cut and weld these Barkow trusses in Atlanta, then ship them up pretty economically to Chicago and then put them in place. So, and if you know from your history books, a Barkow truss is a kind of right angle truss that's porous, right? You can kind of move through it. So the idea was to, in a way, spatialize structure, which is also an idea that goes back to Kahn, that you could actually move through these spaces. You could program it over time. These guys are up here looking down at the machines, which are machine tools, cutting, lasers, bending, punching machines to produce parts, again, for John Deere tractors, but to use structure as a kind of matrix. And I think this goes back to the Conrad Waxman stuff too, but again, using the technologies, and even in a place like America, where you can, these guys, I mean, they can really do steel really well. In places in America, you can put these things together in place, which are completely, custom welded pieces, complete one-offs within that structure. That we could do that, and then, using a material Corten we never used, but like Sarin is using Corten, right, in the 50s and 60s. That scales down to these wetlands. So you have the highway on one side and these super peaceful wetlands on the other side using this technology. So I mean, it's a building you can build for $250 a square foot, which is like kind of a bargain to me. And very quickly in steel construction. So also this idea about building culture. You would never build a building like this in Marrakesh. You're using completely different materials. But you know, literally, which would be the Rust Belt, you know, could easily build this kind of construction. So, and we were talking about that yesterday, you know, like what, you know, what is the American building culture and how to embrace that rather than, you know, try to do a Swiss building, you know, in downtown Chicago, but really take that on and build components like this. Is a laser cut chandelier that we produce on site also for the building with structure. Topographical, and again, I guess going back to my slides of Montana, is a way that we like to work also, especially, you know, when we arrived in Berlin in the you know, early 90s, you know, there was no way we were going to get work in the center, so we worked in the peripheries, which was at the time, and this is when we were teaching at the AA, and we were really fascinated by the peripheries of Berlin, where you had these kind of demilitarized sites. This site was used by the Soviets, where they built these berms to protect their barracks, which at the same time, strangely, you know, resembled the scale of land art, you know, these huge berm pieces. So, I mean, so we thought, oh, you know, that's a great material. And at the time, Claude Perrin came to the AA, he's talking about the architecture of the oblique, about the sort of oblique surfaces is the most sort of, you know, stimulating way to experience architecture. So, you know, he's like this kind of 68 French guy. So we're looking at this and then again, we're able to, you know, through Europe, you know, we're doing competition. So this is a competition we won. Could rethink the idea of a biosphere, which is a kind of gigantic greenhouse, which was for the German Garden Show, which is about kind of repairing these damaged or demilitarized sites in Germany. So instead of making an object, we wanted to do a kind of excavation so it wouldn't compete with the sort of UNESCO protected monuments that are nearby. And to produce a building again, and this is something we also like, the idea that buildings are site generated, that through the context of this site, which is not a kind of architectural one, but more of a kind of landscape, could produce these four berms, which we make, which creates this kind of greenhouse garden space with these kind of suspended bridge and paths that zigzag through the space. And then roofs the whole thing with a kind of simple precast concrete roof. So in a way, you know, these projects kind of came through the kind of parallel the things we were teaching and thinking about at the time. But also for us, it was a way about thinking about Berlin again as we started to work from the outside to the inside, urbanistically, to make a project that again. So this is Peter Lax's gardens that again kind of reconstituting the demilitarized sites into a kind of public park, and where our building, you know, complements that and, you know, spatially connects to the park through the construction of a kind of topography. So, and again, the idea of building the building as found. So, I mean, we just use, you know, logs, dirt, concrete, East German precast company that was nearby. To build this thing, which we produced like in 12 months. I mean, it was really insane. We built this thing and then steel facade systems to enclose it, to produce a space that, again, also thinking, you know, could this thing have an afterlife? So, you know, recently we've been thinking about transforming it into, you know, like a school, like a grade school that could fit within this space. But this was like 20 years ago, but really an idea about landscape, which is another sort of strong, you know, impulse in the work, you know, which has continued in more recent projects. This was opera sets for Fidelio in the Teatro on the Mean, which is where Fidelio was originally shown or produced by Beethoven, and did a set for Christoph Waltz's production of Fidelio. So we produced a kind of double helix within this Baroque shape here, so that again, a set as a kind of three-dimensional construct is almost as deep as the theater itself. It had a kind of, again, you know, more mathematical, digital way of drawing it and showing it. We're sort of producing it in models in our studios in Berlin with the idea of translating this into timber construction. So, and the theaters, it's very old. So we built this thing in Poland out of timber construction in components. So you could put these components to the back door of the theater, almost like a ship in a bottle. You can build it through this. So this is kind of a backstage view of this thing, looking back out towards the audience of this thing in timber construction. So the singers, to move up and in, exit, and move through it. We could change this thing through light. We tried a version where we spun it around, but it was really complicated. So we ended up doing it more of a static construction, again in timber, but topography as architecture in a highly corrugated way where the singers are moving through. It was also performative in the sense that Honeck, the conductor for the music, said for him it was acoustically perfect. It gave him sight lines through all of the singers in a way where they could see each other doing that. But we continue this idea of topographical. This is like a typical kind of live work space that we're building right now in Berlin on a corner site. So we built this as a radial plan, clad in a kind of broken granite thing. But if you thought about the Biosphere project, I mean, in the meantime, we started to work on much more urban and more central projects in Berlin. In this case, affordable housing here, market price housing, office on a site like this. So this, would be kind of a typical everyday project for us. But then, looking at granite, which we can cut, simply, and then clad the facades for this. So this would, kind of represent a kind of typical project that we're doing parallel, again, to the more, experimental work, but doing projects with that. But as well as in Atlanta, where we're working right now, but really, thinking about these projects, I suppose, in a more topographical way in terms of how they situate. This project's on the Atlanta's Beltway, which is Atlanta's kind of answer to the High Line in New York, which is a pedestrian kind of bike loop that goes around the entire city. For in this case, housing, so both market price and affordable housing within this kind of site. Bringing more of a module, I suppose, maybe European idea of housing in units that can be smaller or bigger, can vary, can change, and complement it with a series of towers on the left side. So, and as we move it, from industrial, we started doing industrial projects, then we were doing office buildings, and now thinking, more and more, and also with our teaching about housing and how that can manifest and how we can think about that in different kinds of cities and different configurations. So we're planning for this project, but this will be our first, very large project in the States. I guess we were talking, everybody's talking about timber, in particular with Los Angeles with the fires, but I think we're still using timber a lot in Europe. We don't have the sort of natural catastrophe fees that you seem to have here. But for Stihl headquarters, Stihl, as you probably know, makes chainsaws, and they have their own forest, which they can use as a kind of crop, or they can cultivate their own forest. So our proposal for Stihl was to use their chainsaws to again, well, yeah, thinking about history again, back to Waxman, the space range, kind of revisit that project. But we thought it was cool with this client because you could, they could literally produce the materials for their showrooms on site. They just take their chainsaws, which are, pretty cool chainsaws, chop these trees down, put these trusses together, and then put it together on site. So we would create, the showroom where they show their chainsaws and boots and all the kind of gear they have coming out of that, out of the material that they would make on site. So this is, it's like about the time we really started looking at timber as a material. Again, for me as an old carpenter, it made sense to use this kind of a material. Again, this kind of you know, related to kind of historical project, but using it in a very different way and really in a low tech way. So there's nothing really high tech about this. You can kind of bolt this thing together and lift it in place really quickly. That sort of refers to another project we did a couple of years ago in Austin, which was the what we call the Texas 2x4 A-frame project. You know, I grew up in Montana reading magazines like Sunset Magazine. You remember these things? And this was kind of, you know, like groovy lifestyle magazine, you know, mid-century modernism. But one of the things in Montana was the A-frame structure, which is cheap. You could build a cabin for, you know, $6,000 or so as a kind of a holiday home or something. But to me, it was a project that never got fully investigated, never really got fully thought out. So we started modeling this in terms of A-frames that could be more complex, also, you know, programmatically more complex. So we cooked up an idea for UT, where with $5,000 worth of 2x4s, you could produce configurable houses based on wherever the site is, how many people live in it, how it works. You know, it could be net zero. You could put a voltaic on it. It could create gardens and these kind of ravines in the structure. So we started programming this. So it got built as kind of rough framing in the showrooms at UT with this thing, which we could build. You know, we built the whole thing like in 2 weeks, and then went to the Salvation Army and just kind of you know, kitted it out with beds and chairs and tables. You know, we made 2x4. You know, the Enzo Mari chairs and tables for the thing. We tested again, you know, in our showrooms in Berlin. And then we went on site and put this thing together. And this is, you know, very much in the spirit of the workshops we did here a few years ago, where we would just, like, within a week, you can construct these amazing things, and you have a lot of space here, so you should keep doing that. But we did this with the UT guys, and then, you know, again, it's just the rough construction, but these are Enzo Mari furniture. So you can make a chair, you know, for like $20, a table with 2x4s, listenable. Structurally, it makes sense. It's easy. We could clad it in glass and polycarbonate. But again, you know, using it as a way of setting up a project and then evolving. The students were directly involved in building this thing with us. So it was a really, you know, cool project, which wasn't per se, you know, something we were doing in the offices in Berlin, but a way of producing that. We continue with timber, you know, for universities like Rice, where it kind of makes sense, mass timber for dormitories, redundant housing on site, where we did this, started, you know, during the COVID breakout, brought all this material on site in Houston, put it together, clad it in brick and stucco, which kind of riffs off of the context of the campus. So it has this kind of wood core, but yeah, which may work for Los Angeles. We have this kind of freedom to clad the exterior in a very different materiality, which could solve the problem. I mean, this is my own house I did a couple years ago with my brother in Bozeman, which uses a courtyard type, which, as you can see in kind of suburban Bozeman, is not a kind of typical way of building. But it made total sense on a relatively large site next to my brother's farm here, where you could do, again, more conventional timber framing to build a courtyard house, which is both kind of introverted house, so it's very private, at the same time has views, you know, out towards the mountains. It has a kind of studio, which I'll be using next week to work here, you know, bedrooms, living room spaces here done, you know, very quickly and pretty cheaply, you know, just in stud framing with glulam roofs. This is kind of a split section, which shows that it's kind of slightly and topographically adjusted to the slope, which is of the site, which slopes on the diagonal, which, you know, again, you know, could be a kind of prototype, but again, not I think the advantage is still like stick building is that everybody can do it, and so it becomes kind of affordable. It can still be done quite quickly on site. For site, like you're combining it with a concrete base, which is all the heating for the house, concrete, and taking advantage of the really bad quality of concrete you get in America. So kind of celebrating that a little bit. So it's rock, garden. It's not Switzerland, I know. So, but adapting and taking about windows and doors from Germany, but everything else is built on site. Including your chandeliers, you built all those for a house like that. So I think, which again is even both have this kind of history of mid-century modernism. The Neutra log house down the road from this house, which was interesting. We've done, I think, getting close to finishing here, but we continued this is the Trump campus building 2008 when we finished actually not too long ago on the right, which is an education center for young apprentices in a factory site in Stuttgart. We had built this thing, and this was really the first building that we mass customized. We went down to the black soil for these guys, and they prefabricated all this super complicated honeycomb roof with computer and digital cutting technologies, with working in with SOVEC, looking at biological hierarchical structures to build this thing. So this was kind of first what I would call pavilion on this industrial campus, which was a place which was historically the cafeteria for the factory workers, but they also used it for parties, for lectures, for music, as a kind of place for encounter for this structure. So this was steel and glue laminated timber construction for the building. The more recent one is a education center for young apprentices who learn how to run these machine tools on site. And we built this in a kind of similar fashion in timber, a lot of prefabricated timber construction in glulam. Produces as usual, versioning the project in many different iterations before we put it together in this kind of kind of a polygon shaped interior with at the center a theater for the students with this kind of spiral roof. So timber, channel glass, skin, and also using the tradition of in southern Germany this Fachwerk, or the timber cross-braced construction was kind of ubiquitous in that region historically. So both the space could be used, its exteriors could be used by these kids, or they learn how to run these machines on the interior. So these are double height shop spaces that are kind of zigzagging around the center space, which is this auditorium with a kind of diffuse crystal formed skylight above that, which complements the building. So we just finished this not too long ago, but again, these are things that we're working on, as well as finishing this building also. I mean, I'm working at really different scales. So this is a hotel, which will be Berlin's tallest building, their first skyscraper in Berlin, which is kind of flat city out in the more industrial periphery near the new airport, as a kind of ensemble of pieces which we can phase and build. So over times, using this idea of a geometrical tangram for organizing these components, which can program differently for concert hall, or concert hall, the hotel tower itself, atrium, entrance to it. So this is, I think, the last site, but this is last week when we did the topping up party for this thing. So I think that is something we're interested in working at now, both working the kind of peripheries in a kind of literal way, as well as working in the center, different kind of programming, different centers. But I guess we call it kind of, architecture in the expansive field, as a way of thinking and working for the last few years. So I'm right on time. Great to do that. Yeah.
Do we need help with vote for this? Frank, thanks so much for that talk. That was just great. And this is on. Great. Anybody got questions in the audience? Can we?
Over on the right.
How are you? I just have comments. I
What's your
welcome,
question?
okay, just real quick comment. I welcome you bringing German European architecture to the United States. It's like, cybersecurity laws in, Europe, they're just strict and stringent. And in America, they're like guidelines and goals that we could use here. It's very different. Germanic architecture, I'm studying Spaniard architecture, and they follow the Germanic luxury type. And it's very like simple and basic, and US is more aesthetic. It's like a woman's natural beauty, and then she puts on eyeliner and like false eyelashes, and she's attractive. That's the difference. Thank you. I agree with everything.
Thank you. Questions, anybody? Yes.
So, first, I just want to say thank you. And many of the students here are in this class, the third year, it's the end of their core. They're being bombarded with structural requirements, managing the materiality of their projects.
Yeah.
And I just, more than anything else, I want to ask you for extra words of encouragement that they push through that isn't, those things aren't in conflict with research.
Right.
and
Yeah.
art,
Yeah. Yeah.
But that they push through
Yeah.
those things to the other side to get
Okay.
to the interesting.
I'd like to encourage you to push through. And no, I mean, when I went to undergraduate school, the structural engineering was, we would just do formulas all day, and it had no meaning or consequences. And now, some of these things, materiality or structural engineering, become primary drivers of a project. So, and again, we don't do it in a very obedient way. It's not about following the rules, but exploiting possibilities, which I think I showed. So I think that's when I started working with Swiss architects like Jörg Kansad, and these guys are weird, and they were really interesting, and they were so in a way these there was a kind of a simulation of both these kind of disciplines informing each other directly. So I think that's where it became really exciting, or starting with, and Swiss architects will talk about this all the time and let you go crazy, but starting with materials and thinking about it. So, and what's the difference between steel construction or timber or concrete or hybrid construction? So, we started looking at those collaborations in a very different light, I think, which again, I think what you're suggesting should circle back to the studios and works. I think we did this at the AAA with, technical studies and structures and really good projects that would somehow inform each other, and give the projects kind of gravitas, I think, that we look to.
Thanks. Other questions? Yeah.
There you go.
And a lot of us are in our thesis here, and I feel like we're kind of struggling between, I guess, a concept or an idea versus actually designing and doing. And it seems like a lot of your work is very experimental and very kind of thinking while practicing. And so I'm curious what your advice is on kind of idealizing something versus just doing it.
Idealizing versus doing it, I don't know, but Wes, we were talking earlier, like a GST, it was always about what you made, right? And it was always about starting that way, and it wasn't about ideation is going to produce some kind of or conceptualizing the booster project, but this kind of resonating between the things that we produce and the things. So you know, I give a lot of credence. So I got, you know, I like students, you know, like produce, and you know, I know we were just doing reviews at Harvard. You see everything as a kind of final project, but I was always the you know the trip or the travel is more important than destination. So I very I give a lot of credence to process how things are produced, but so in a way, I know there's a strange kind of intuition of producing things and the kind of information that say models or drawings give you that I think, I mean, I can't tell you how many projects we've done where I kind of post legitimize the project, like, well, you know, we were thinking about this and this, and this was just whole bullshit, you know, we just started producing these things and then the project, you know, so there's, it's like post-rationalizing things as a kind of narrative about the project, but a lot of it comes through, I don't know, making or even accidents or messing stuff up. So, but you know, you've got kind of history of knowledge, you know, and that we can always kind of employ that stuff, you know, like, oh, well, you know, the Romans were doing terrazzo, you know, 2,000 years ago. So, well, that's interesting. So, but I, you know, but we're also, like, you know, it's also, I was thinking about that too, you know, like the practice is something emerging, you know, I don't want to do white buildings all the time, or, you know, we're not like Richard Meyer, you just keep doing it, like, but the practice can be something that's emerging. So we're constantly searching for new ways of doing things. So I think that it makes the practice interesting and the kind of scope of work differentiated. I think so I think that searching these kind of discoveries help drive that and trigger the kind of work. So part of it's like paying attention and looking what's out there, and then in a way the powers of imagination, like what, you know, if we have this kind of concrete, what can we do with it? So, and I think architecture always evolves that way, right? There has to be some kind of moment, whether it's technology or culture, that could trigger that. So I mean, it's going beyond your question, but I think it's all tied together.
Yeah, just after, jump in.
Beautiful lecture. Yeah, your comments just, is this on? Is this on? Okay. It's reminding me of Steve Jobs' comment about connecting the dots in retrospect,
Right.
connecting the points in retrospect. And like when he was a student at Reed College studying calligraphy and later on doing Apple,
Yeah.
founded that.
It's not like meaning isn't found, it's given.
Yeah. And I thought your story was really inspiring in that way. Your process story was really inspiring in the way that it feels like now the work is just converging in some way, like taking the best aspects of those investigations and starting to like the coalescing. I mean, does it feel that way in practice right now? Like those experiments and those ideas are coming to fruition in some way? It really
does, yeah. But
it
it's
feels
not,
that way looking at the work.
it's not linear.
No.
This kind of idea of an active archive, or, you know, some things just stay in the drawer, some things get pulled out of the drawer and they get activated. So it's not, you know, we did this and then that turned into this and this, but it's kind of the idea of archival, you know, which is both about techniques and technology, but it's also about typologies. It's about, so I think that kind of production is important to us, but it's not. It's not quite as neat as we probably you know, you do this and you do this and then you get this.
Yeah.
But it's but I think in an elusive kind of strategy, there's different threads that kind of pull it work. But that's the ambition for sure.
It looks like a beautiful confluence.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
One more question here.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think maybe it's a similar question, but I think it's really intriguing, all the different scales that you've practiced at.
Yeah.
And then especially, I think what you ended with this tower, practically tall.
Yeah.
At the same time, you're producing this experiment, once again, you just mentioned about the terrazzo, or working at something that's very much like at the hand scale. And so I'd be interested to know, once again, how do you maybe think about the relationship between these two things at different scales, or is it
Yeah.
more just that, well, this is one thing?
Yeah.
How do those things relate or not relate potentially?
It's a really good question, I think, and I think there's always a desire to kind of embed those things at multiple scales, and I think at the same time, the kind of desire for architects to do exact work, you know, where you're constantly integrating everything and you're doing the furniture, it seems unrealistic. And, you know, sometimes the architecture is just a framework and people live in them however they want to, particularly the residential projects. But I think usually there's a ambition to try to embed these things within particularly the larger projects. But the tower, for example, I mean, it has a structural idea. There's a strong idea about the facade making in it, the scale of it. There's an atrium, space frame, lobby within it. But I think it depends from project to project. There's different kind of gauging of what you can do. But I think the idea of absolute control is a kind of myth. And which seems also kind of okay, where we're not trying to control everything. We kind of set up frameworks or situations, particularly in more public buildings or more, or private also in terms of more mass housing as we're working in Atlanta right now. But yeah, it's a good question, I think, like what do these things always mean something for each project, or again, there's a certain amount of editing that's going on and identifying of what you can do and what you can't do.
One last question right here.
Your work has a perceived level of craft, and I find it quite beautiful. I'm curious what your views are on today's world of 3D printing, digital fabrication, and parametric modeling, because
Okay.
I want to know how, maybe if your firm is employing those. I cannot tell, but I'm really attracted to your work, and I want to know where you stand on kind of where we are today, or at least in Southern California, because it's not happening here.
No, I really looked at that question because I think it's super. I mean, the idea of bricolage, I think, is about inclusion. So if I need a hammer, I'll use a hammer, and if I need a complex 3D digital thing, I'll use that. I'll use both of them. So like you have parametricisms, you know, saving the world. I mean, people don't believe that, you know, but it may appear in this. So I think it's a much more hybrid, inclusive, and at the end of the day, realistic way of working. So, you know, like why, you know, I'll work in Montana with guys, you know, framers, you know, work with 2x6 and 2x6 construction because they can do that. So it's kind of working with the systems and maybe tweaking it or adjusting it somewhat to the work. But you know, we have no prejudice for one technique over another. We'll use whatever we can get our hands on and where it is. So if we're working in Korea, it's very different than working in America. Cash is very different working in Switzerland. Southern Germany is very different than Northern Germany. So I think there is a sense, and that's what's intriguing about working now in the States. Is there's certain things that they do amazingly well here and certain things they do terribly. So, you know, how do you surf that, or how do you adjust or align with that? So I again, bricolage is really an idea about inclusion. So I like low tech, I like high tech. It's all the same.
Frank, thanks for coming in. Great to have you.